Delaware is the smallest state in the country by land area, and it was the first state, period. On December 7, 1787, Delaware's delegates voted unanimously to ratify the United States Constitution, faster than Pennsylvania, faster than Massachusetts, faster than every other state in the Union. This was not an accident of alphabetical order. For over a century, Delaware had been passed between Swedish traders, Dutch merchants, English proprietors, and William Penn's Pennsylvania Charter, never fully governing itself, always someone else's afterthought. And then, when it finally had the chance to act on its own terms, it moved first, moved unanimously, and made history before anyone else had finished arguing. Small does not mean slow. Delaware proved that in one unanimous vote. Here's the scope of what Delaware's founding actually involved. This tiny stretch of riverfront territory was claimed by Sweden in 1638, seized by the Dutch in 1655, conquered by the English in 1664, and then granted to William Penn in 1682 as an almost incidental addition to his Pennsylvania Charter, meant to give Pennsylvania direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. For nearly a century, Delaware's 3 counties shared a legislature and a governor with Pennsylvania, even after they gained their own separate assembly in 1704. Delaware never had a moment of clean, singular founding the way Massachusetts or Virginia did. It was assembled from other people's decisions, other people's charters, and other people's colonial ambitions, and it still managed to become the first state in the Union. That is either an accident of history or the direct result of understanding exactly how much leverage a small, strategically placed colony actually has. Today, we cover the full founding story of Delaware, from the Swedish settlement at Fort Christina in 1638 through the Dutch and English conquests to William Penn's acquisition of the 3 lower counties in 1682, to the colony's slow development of its own separate legislature and identity, to Delaware's contribution during the Revolutionary War, including Caesar Rodney's legendary overnight ride to break a deadlocked vote for independence, and finally to the unanimous ratification of the Constitution on December 7, 1787, that made Delaware the first state in the United States. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly why the smallest colony in this entire series became the very first word spoken in the sentence that created the country. Back to the beginning. Delaware's colonial story begins not with the English, but with the Swedes. In March 1638, Swedish colonists, sponsored by the New Sweden Company, sailed up the Delaware River and established Fort Christina, near present-day Wilmington, the first permanent Scandinavian settlement anywhere in North America. The colony was small and commercially motivated, focused primarily on the fur trade with the local Lenape people, and it never grew beyond a few hundred settlers across its entire 18-year existence. Peter Minuit, the same Peter Minuit who had purchased Manhattan for the Dutch 12 years earlier, led this Swedish expedition, having switched employers after a falling out with the Dutch West India Company. New Sweden introduced the log cabin to North America, a Scandinavian building technique that would later become one of the defining architectural symbols of the American frontier. New Sweden's independence lasted only 17 years. The Dutch, who considered the entire Delaware Valley part of their own New Netherland claim, had tolerated the Swedish colony as a minor irritant for years, until Swedish forces seized the nearby Dutch Fort Casimir in 1654. Peter Stuyvesant, the same Director General who would later surrender New Amsterdam to the English without a fight, responded to this provocation with uncharacteristic decisiveness. In September 1655, Stuyvesant led a fleet of 7 ships and over 300 soldiers up the Delaware River and forced the surrender of New Sweden without significant bloodshed. The Swedish colonists were permitted to remain, retain their property, and continue practicing their Lutheran faith, a pragmatic Dutch decision that preserved the Scandinavian cultural imprint on the region for generations. New Sweden was gone as a political entity. Its people and their log cabins stayed. Delaware's third change of ownership came in 1664, the same year the English seized New Amsterdam. English forces under Sir Robert Carr took the Delaware River settlements with minimal resistance, folding them into the territory granted by King Charles II to his brother James, the Duke of York. For the next 18 years, the Delaware settlements existed as a loosely governed appendage of New York, administered from Manhattan by officials who had little practical interest in a small riverfront territory hundreds of miles away. This period produced almost no distinct institutional development, no assembly, no dedicated colonial government, just a distant governor's occasional attention. Delaware was, at this point, the colonial equivalent of an afterthought attached to an afterthought. Everything changed for Delaware in 1682, when the Duke of York granted William Penn the territory that would become the three lower counties on the Delaware: Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex. Penn's motivation was entirely practical. His new Pennsylvania charter, granted the previous year, was landlocked in its access to the Atlantic Ocean, and control of the Delaware River's lower reaches solved that problem immediately. Penn absorbed the three counties into his colonial administration, and for the next several decades, Pennsylvania and Delaware shared a single governor and, at times, a single legislative assembly. But the lower counties never fully integrated with Pennsylvania's Quaker political culture. Their population was more religiously diverse, more oriented toward Anglican and Presbyterian traditions, and increasingly resentful of Philadelphia's dominance over decisions that affected their daily lives. The tension between Pennsylvania and its three southern counties would only grow. The tension between the three lower counties and Pennsylvania's dominant government came to a head in 1704, when the counties were finally granted their own separate colonial assembly, a body distinct from Pennsylvania's legislature, meeting in Newcastle rather than Philadelphia. This was a significant institutional step, but it came with a critical limitation. Delaware and Pennsylvania continued to share the same governor, appointed by the Penn family's proprietary authority, until the Revolution severed that connection entirely in 1776. For 72 years, Delaware operated as a strange hybrid, legislatively independent, but executively tethered to a colony that had never quite treated it as an equal. This arrangement forced Delaware's political culture to become remarkably self-reliant and pragmatic, since the colony had to accomplish its own legislative goals without ever fully controlling its own executive branch. When the Revolutionary War began, Delaware's small population meant it could never contribute large numbers of troops, but the soldiers it did send earned an outsized reputation. The Delaware Regiment, formed in 1776, fought at the Battle of Long Island, the Battle of White Plains, the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, and later distinguished itself at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina in 1781, where its disciplined bayonet charge helped secure a decisive American victory. Continental Army officers repeatedly praised the regiment's steadiness under fire, and the unit's nickname, the Blue Hen's Chickens, after a local breed of fighting gamecock prized for its aggression, became a lasting symbol of Delaware's outsized military contribution. A colony too small to field an army fielded one anyway and made it count. The single most famous moment in Delaware's colonial history is Caesar Rodney's overnight ride in July 1776. Delaware's three-man delegation to the Continental Congress was deadlocked. One delegate favored independence, one opposed it, and Rodney, the deciding vote, was 80 miles away in Dover, dealing with a local militia crisis, while also suffering from advanced facial cancer that had disfigured half his face, forcing him to wear a green silk scarf to cover the wound. Upon receiving urgent word of the deadlock, Rodney rode through a violent thunderstorm through the night, covering roughly 80 miles on horseback in under 18 hours. Arriving in Philadelphia on the morning of July 2nd, 1776, still in his riding boots and spurs, mud splattered from the journey, just in time to cast Delaware's deciding vote in favor of independence. Without that ride, Delaware's delegation would have been split, its vote effectively void, and the historical record of unanimous colonial support for independence would look very different. Before we get to Delaware's unanimous ratification and why becoming the first state actually mattered, comment below. 10 episodes in now. Which colony has surprised you most so far? Not the one with the biggest story, but the one you least expected to matter this much. I read every reply. The Revolutionary War finally severed the awkward 72-year executive tie between Delaware and Pennsylvania. In September 1776, Delaware adopted its own state constitution, formally establishing itself as an independent state with its own governor for the first time in its colonial history. This was a quietly significant moment. Delaware had spent nearly a century as an institutional hybrid, legislatively separate but executively dependent, and the Revolution gave it the opportunity to finally become a complete, self-governing political entity in its own right. Delaware's new constitution was notably moderate compared to Pennsylvania's radically democratic 1776 constitution, reflecting the state's more conservative, Anglican-influenced political culture and its history of pragmatic, careful institutional development rather than revolutionary experimentation. During the Articles of Confederation period, from 1781 to 1789, Delaware, like every small state, faced a structural problem that would sound familiar from New Jersey's story. Under the Articles, each state had one vote in Congress, regardless of population, which protected small states like Delaware. But the Articles also produced a chronically weak national government, unable to raise revenue, regulate interstate commerce, or enforce its own laws. Delaware's leaders understood this weakness firsthand. A small state benefits from federal structures that protect it, but only if that federal government actually functions. This practical understanding would prove decisive in December 1787, when Delaware had to decide whether to trade the safety of small state equality under the Articles for the promise of a stronger, more effective constitution. Here is exactly how fast Delaware moved once the Constitutional Convention finished its work in September 1787. The document needed 9 of 13 states to ratify before it took effect. Delaware's state legislature called a ratifying convention almost immediately. 30 delegates gathered in Dover. They debated, and on December 7, 1787, just 83 days after the Constitution was signed in Philadelphia, Delaware's convention voted. The result? 30-0. Unanimous. Not a single dissenting vote. Pennsylvania, despite starting its ratification process earlier and having far more political and economic weight, did not finish until 5 days later. New Jersey followed 12 days after that. Georgia took another 5 days beyond that. Delaware, the smallest state, the one nobody expected to lead anything, got there first, and got there unanimously. Delaware's speed and unanimity were not accidental. As the smallest state, Delaware's delegates understood, more clearly than almost anyone else at the ratifying conventions, exactly how much the new Constitution's structure protected them. The Great Compromise, negotiated in part because of New Jersey's insistence on equal state representation, as we covered in the previous episode, guaranteed Delaware 2 senators in the new Congress, exactly as many as Virginia, exactly as many as Massachusetts. For a state with barely 50,000 residents, that guarantee was extraordinary. Delaware's delegates did not need to deliberate at length over competing interests, because the new Constitution offered them almost pure upside: federal protection, equal Senate representation, and none of the vulnerability that came with being a small, isolated state under the weak Articles of Confederation. When the math is that favorable, a state does not need to negotiate, it just needs to vote. On the morning of December 7, 1787, 30 delegates gathered in the Golden Fleece Tavern in Dover, Delaware, an unassuming public house that would become, that day, the site of the first ratification of the United States Constitution. There was no grand hall, no elaborate ceremony, just 30 men, a document, and a vote. Each delegate rose in turn to affirm their support. When the final tally was read, 30 in favor, 0 opposed, Delaware became officially and permanently State Number 1. The delegates reportedly celebrated that evening with a modest dinner and toasts, aware that they had accomplished something historically significant, but characteristically Delaware in their restraint about it. No fireworks, no parade, just the quiet satisfaction of having gone first and having gone unanimously. Delaware's constitutional legacy did not end with its first-place finish in December 1787. The state ratified the Bill of Rights on January 28, 1790, again among the earliest states to do so, reinforcing the same pattern of early, decisive institutional commitment. Delaware's motto, adopted in the 19th century, is simply liberty and independence, a modest phrase for a state whose entire founding story is about understanding, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else, exactly what a new federal structure could offer a small, historically overlooked colony. Delaware never needed to be the biggest state to matter. It needed to be the fastest one to say yes. Delaware's landscape reflects its history as a corridor state rather than a frontier state. The Delaware River and Delaware Bay dominate its eastern geography, while the flat, fertile coastal plain that makes up most of the state's land area made it ideal for the grain and tobacco farming that sustained its colonial economy. The Delmarva Peninsula, which Delaware shares with parts of Maryland and Virginia, gave the colony a distinctive geographic identity separate from its larger neighbors, even as it remained politically entangled with them. Wilmington, at the state's northern edge along the Christina River near the site of the original Fort Christina, would later become Delaware's industrial and commercial center. But throughout the colonial period, Delaware remained a quiet landscape of rivers, farms, and small towns, exactly the unassuming setting that produced an outsized historical moment. Here is Delaware's specific contribution to the series' larger argument about founding and power. Every colony in this series has had to answer a version of the same question. How does a community secure its own interests within a much larger, often indifferent political system? Virginia answered with wealth and land. Massachusetts answered with religious conformity. Pennsylvania answered with constitutional principle. New Jersey answered by forcing a structural compromise that protected small states permanently. Delaware's answer is different from all of these, and in some ways more universally applicable. When the terms are genuinely favorable, do not wait to see what everyone else decides. Move first. Move decisively. Move unanimously if you can. Delaware's entire colonial history passed between 4 different powers, never fully governing itself, always someone else's addition, could have produced a cautious, hesitant political culture. Instead, it produced a colony that, when its moment finally came, moved faster than anyone else in the room. Delaware remains the smallest state in the country by land area, and it remains, in the official record, the first state. Its license plates still say so. Caesar Rodney's statue stands in Dover, his cape flying, forever mid-ride. The Golden Fleece Tavern site in Dover is preserved as a historic landmark, marking the exact spot where 30 men voted unanimously and changed the order of everything that followed. Delaware's founding story does not have the scale of Virginia's, the moral weight of Pennsylvania's, or the constitutional drama of New Jersey's. What it has instead is a simple, durable lesson. Being small does not mean waiting for permission to matter. Sometimes it means being the first one willing to say yes. That's Delaware, episode 10 of 13. We have 3 colonies left, and they bring some of the most complicated and consequential stories in this entire series. Next up is Maryland. Wait, we've covered Maryland. Next up is Georgia. the last colony founded, established as a debtor's refuge and military buffer against Spanish Florida, led by a man who banned slavery in his colony for its first 18 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with military strategy. That's episode 11. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you there.